I've heard only great things about PPI, and I'm glad that you were able to organize this today. I mostly want to talk about the economics of America's clean energy future, but wanted to just give you a little bit of context about the Council of Economic Advisors. It was created in the 1940s. It's part of the White House, but what I love about it is that it has a real institutional tradition and history of providing the best impartial advice to the president and the White House senior staff on a range of economic issues. And I think that type of advice is often the hardest to give, because you have to combine that economics with some understanding about how things will translate, what you're allowed to do using your administrative authorities, what might pass Congress, and work with people that are trying to figure out how to combine all of that together. I've been in this administration since day one, first at the National Economic Council and now at the Council of Economic Advisors, and have found it really thrilling to work on pretty much the whole range of economic issues. And in the Q&A, happy to discuss more questions on this topic, but if people have broader topics about what CEA does, the role of advising, or other economic issues, we could discuss those as well. And as Kent said, we do always have slots for interns and for junior staff economists who contribute in a lot of exciting ways. So you can find our website for that. What I want to talk about today is really timed for the discussions that are going on in New York at the United Nations about climate and what we can all do to reduce our carbon emissions. And most of what I'm going to talk about is what we can do here to reduce our carbon emissions, and in particular to go into a lot of detail about the clean power plan that we've put forward to reduce emissions from power plants. But I wanted to put this in the context of where we are in the overall energy landscape, because I don't think there's a distinction between what we're doing in terms of climate policies and how it is that we're trying to handle energy more broadly. I think people understand that we are in the midst of an enormous revolution when it comes to energy. The United States leads the world in combined oil and natural gas production. For 3 straight years, we produce more than Saudi Arabia and Russia. Electricity generation from renewables is soaring as well. Wind up 3 times, solar up 10 times. Meanwhile, US gasoline consumption, which as recently as 2005 was projected to rise steadily into the future, has actually fallen by 5% since that time. And this has contributed to cutting our oil imports by nearly 40%, helping to narrow the US trade deficit to its lowest as a share of the economy. These developments, as I hope to argue and convince you today, are not merely compatible with reduced greenhouse gas emissions, they've been an essential part of how we achieve that goal. At the same time that we've undergone this energy boom, we've also seen a 10% reduction in carbon emissions from 2007 to 2013. That's a larger absolute emissions reduction of any nation in the world over that period. And while the recession was responsible for half of those emissions reductions, the other half, which is still a large amount, reflects the changing ways in which we produce and consume energy. Today I'll be talking about the Climate Action Plan, but as I said, it's one part of the administration's overall all-of-the-above energy strategy. That energy strategy has 3 parts. The first is supporting economic growth and job creation. The second is enhancing energy security. And the third is laying a foundation for a clean energy future. So let me briefly go over those first 2 parts and then spend more time on the third. If you look back all the way to 1775, we've seen big changes in the way in which we as a country use energy. Wood has been pretty much unchanged for that entire time, but coal, then petroleum, and then natural gas have all had their rises. But if you look at what's happened recently, petroleum and coal consumption have been going down. And they've been going down in a way that isn't fully tied to price increases in the same way that you saw with the oil disruptions in the 1970s. At the same time, we're making up for that with an increase in natural gas and renewables. In terms of petroleum, we were producing 5 million barrels per day. That's now gone up to 8.5 million barrels per day. The difference between that is more than the amount of oil that Iraq produces. So it's almost as if we discovered something the size of Iraq. If you look at that combined with the increase in natural gas and measure just the direct contribution to GDP, these two sectors of the economy were contributing relatively little for a long period of time and are now adding 0.2% per year to GDP growth. That may not seem like a large number. It first of all understates the impact because this is just a direct effect. It doesn't include all the linkages to manufacturing and other sectors of the economy. But it's also the case that 0.2% per year, if we had instruments that can do that and last into the future, it's something all of us would take because it accumulates up. The second prong of the all of the above energy strategy is enhancing U.S. energy security. And the developments I've been talking about have had a big impact in that respect as well. If you look at all the turmoil in the Middle East that's in the headlines every day and is an extremely serious national security issue, it's striking that since mid-June, as a lot of that got worse in the Middle East, the price of oil has actually fallen by 15%, and Brent is now trading below $100 per barrel for the first time in years. If you look at the volatility of oil prices, they're the lowest that they've been in a decade. And the reason for this, as you can see in this graph, there have been an increase in unplanned global supply disruptions. That's what you see in the blue line, up about 2.5 million barrels per day of increased global supply disruptions. But at the same time, the growth of U.S. crude oil production has exactly offset the supply disruptions we've seen from the rest of the world and kept the price of Brent relatively constant. Overall, the increased oil production and reduced oil consumption have resulted in the fact that we now produce more oil than we import, and we've cut those imports a lot. We're still vulnerable to what happens around the world in terms of the price of oil. The price of oil is still set on global markets, but we're a little bit less vulnerable because we're producing more, and we're a little bit less vulnerable because price changes are less of a terms of trade shock than they'd otherwise be, and less of those resources are transferred out of the United States abroad, something that the Council of Economic Advisors documented in a report we put out over the summer. All of this is relevant for our clean energy future because the changes in natural gas have enabled it to become an even more cost-effective transition fuel with low carbon. And even America's oil has significantly lower carbon content than a lot of the other oil produced around the world. It's so-called light sweet crude. All of this has helped generate progress just through the economy on carbon emissions. But there's no doubt we need to make more progress. And in 2010, as part of the Cancun agreements, the United States formalized the goal of cutting greenhouse gas emissions in the range of 17% below 2005 levels by 2020. This is part of a broader agreement in which more than 100 other countries, including key emerging economies like China, also offered emission reduction targets of their own. These issues will be further discussed at the UN this week, leading into the discussions in Paris at the Conference of Parties in 2015, where the United States, and we expect other countries around the world, will be making commitments about the trajectory of our carbon emissions post-2020. Achieving the target that we've set for ourselves will require more than just riding the wave of changes that are already underway in the private sector. As we all know, a product's carbon emissions impose greater costs than those paid by its producers and consumers. The impacts these carbon emissions have on climate change and the economy more broadly are what economists call an externality. As a result, if you left consumers and producers to make choices entirely on their own devices, they wouldn't have sufficient incentives to invest in an economically efficient manner, both in the way they act today, what they choose to produce and consume, and perhaps even more importantly, in the way they innovate for the future. The result is a classic economic inefficiency where carbon is overproduced and technologies or practices that could reduce emissions are underinvested in, all of which opens up the possibility for substantial efficiency improvements from regulation or other action in this space. This is something we tried to do legislatively, but did not succeed in Congress. And in the face of that inaction, in 2013, the president put forward a climate action plan, which was designed to cut carbon emissions in the United States, to better prepare us for whatever impact from the climate change that still will happen, and finally to lead the international efforts to address climate change. We've already taken important steps to reduce emissions. One of them was improving the fuel efficiency of the nation's automotive fleet. We're always looking for new actions, whether big or small, that we can take. Last week at the White House, for example, we hosted a lot of major corporations who are making commitments to reduce or eliminate their use of hydrofluorocarbons, which is a particularly potent greenhouse gas. And then we had another group over to the White House of states, communities, and others to increase the deployment of on-site solar energy. But to really hit our 2020 goal and put us in a better position past the 2020 goal, we have to address the 32% of greenhouse gas emissions which come from the electricity generating sector, the majority of those coming from coal-fired power plants. In June of this year, consistent with the direction they got from the president, the EPA put forward its proposed Clean Power Plan. Under the EPA's proposal, power sector emissions would be reduced 30% from their 2005 levels. In addition, it provides states with a lot of flexibility in terms of how to hit this target. And I want to spend the remainder of my time just going into more detail on this rule, because it's just so central to achieving what we're trying to achieve in terms of carbon, and because it's something that we're trying to prompt a national dialogue on. For any regulation you do, there's always a comment period where any of you can submit comments. I know an awful lot of businesses submit their comments and other interested parties. We extended the comment period by 45 days, so maybe you could do double duty, write something up, it'll count as a homework assignment, and you can send it to the EPA, and they take those very seriously, and they read them. Importantly, the debate won't end with the EPA's final rule, because the final rule is all about what states are doing to implement that rule. So that discussion will then continue at the state level. In order to understand how the rule works, it's called 111D, which is the part of the Clean Air Act that it functions under, the EPA looks at what the best states, the best companies are already doing today to reduce their carbon emissions. They then take a look at each state and say, if each state did the best thing that's being done today, how much could they reduce their emissions? They're not assuming the impossible. They're not relying on technology that doesn't yet exist. And in particular, they look at 4 building blocks. They look at what you could do to improve the energy efficiency of existing coal-fired power plants. For example, letting less heat get dissipated and more of it go into the turbine and the generation of electricity. They looked at what we can do to better utilize and increase the utilization of our natural gas plants, because well-to-wheel natural gas, or well-to final use, it's half the carbon of coal. They look at what we can do to add new low or no emission power sources like wind and nuclear. And then finally, they look at what you can do in terms of increased energy efficiency. The combination of all four approaches form the basis of the target that the EPA sets for each state. They don't, however, form the strategy for each state. That's something that each state needs to figure out on its own. It's not command and control regulation. We're not assuming that the federal government knows best. Instead, we're trying to do this in the tradition of the recent environmental policies like the acid rain program and the NOx budget trading program that have succeeded in cutting pollution while embracing market-based solutions. States have flexibility in terms of the timing of the reductions during the 10-year implementation period from 2020 to 2030, and it doesn't mandate a specific approach to doing it. What we would expect a lot of states would choose to do, though, is to use market-based mechanisms that provide a cost-effective way. One of the leading ones is a cap-and-trade system where statewide carbon emissions are capped and a fixed number of pollution allowances are issued to firms. Such a system ensures that firms face the right incentive to reduce emissions and simultaneously that emissions reductions find their way to the cheapest place. The premise of such a system isn't that the government knows how to reduce emissions, it's that the experts in that are businesses and consumers all across a state, and that in response to the right incentives, they'll do it. There's other market-based alternatives like tradable carbon emissions standard or the inclusion of a carbon emissions factor in electricity dispatching decisions that are also worthy of further study. Perhaps most importantly, states are very much encouraged to work together and set these types of systems up across their borders. If you look at the benefits associated with this plan, the EPA estimates them at $55 to $93 billion per year in 2011 dollars. These benefits come from two areas. The first is we put a cost on carbon, what we call the social cost of carbon. And for each ton of carbon that's emitted, we think that that does about $37 of damage. That's based on everything from the extra cost of air conditioners to the damage of coastal flooding and everything in between. In addition to the social cost of carbon, the rule has very important what are called co-benefits in terms of reducing pollutants into the lower levels of the atmosphere, like sulfur dioxide, nitrogen dioxide, and particulate matter. All told, the Clean Power Plan will cut these pollutants over 25% by 2030, which will reduce asthma attacks, heart attacks, hospital admissions, and prevent about 5,000 premature deaths nationwide each year. I should say as an aside, these co-benefits are very important in the international discussion as well. A recent IMF study of the costs and benefits of climate change found that these types of health improvements could result in net economic benefits from addressing climate change. And as we engage with China on the issue of carbon emissions, they're certainly concerned about the far future and the impact it'll have on climate change, but they're particularly concerned about the pollution that they face, the enormous amount in their cities today, and a lot of the same steps that they need to take to improve the lives of their citizens and meet with the demands they have for clean air in Beijing, also at the same time help with the climate. While the substantial benefits of the Clean Power Plan are clear, I assume that everything you're taught here at Wharton is that you need to ask how those benefits trade against any potential costs that the plan would have. As I've been explaining, a lot of the flexibility and a lot of the market-based mechanisms and ability to work across states should keep the costs as low as we can possibly keep them. It's also important to understand that to the degree there are any compliance costs, they don't necessarily translate dollar for dollar into higher electricity bills for consumers, as energy efficiency programs and technological innovation would lead to reduced electricity demand. In fact, the EPA estimated in its regulatory impact analysis that there will be a small increase in electricity prices, but that the final bills themselves will decline by 8% by 2030 as customers reduce their electricity usage and scale up their investments in energy efficiency. These modest price effects and the fact that electricity costs account for only about 1 to 3% of total production costs in most manufacturing industries should alleviate any concerns that the Clean Power Plan will reduce the competitiveness of the industrial sector. Overall, the annual costs of the transition are estimated to range from $7 to $9 billion in today's dollars once the plan is fully implemented in 2030. That's less than $30 per person per year, and it's just a small fraction, less than 1/6 of the benefits that the plan will have. Some have said that we should wait to develop a perfect plan to deal with carbon emissions, the type that you might work on at a school like Wharton. I don't think that we should delay in order to let the perfect be the enemy of what I think is a very good approach to the problem. At the Council of Economic Advisors, we released another report this summer that quantified the cost of delaying dealing with climate change. And it found, looking at a meta-analysis of a range of studies, the cost of dealing with climate change if we wait another decade is 40% in present value, higher than if we act now. Moreover, we also found that if waiting a decade means that we end up tolerating a larger increase in global temperatures, as an illustration, they go up 3 degrees centigrade instead of 2 degrees centigrade, then global output would decline by nearly 1%. In the context of the United States, that's equivalent to $150 billion of economic output each year. Moreover, delaying would not just affect US emissions, it would substantially reduce our leverage in the global arena, undermining our ability to secure the types of emissions reductions that we'd like to see from other countries and that will ultimately benefit not just them, but the United States and the world as well. Another argument we hear is that we should wait to be sure that climate change is happening and to figure out just how costly it'll be to avert it. The basic premise of this argument is wrong. Climate change is happening. It is affecting us today. And while it's true that we're uncertain about the exact magnitude of this climate change and the exact magnitude of the damages and the costs, this uncertainty is actually an argument for doing more and sooner as a form of insurance, not for doing less, something that economist Marty Weitzman and others have fleshed out in great detail. A lot of the logic of this is that carbon emissions and subsequent higher temperatures increase our risk of hitting climatological tipping points, like the potential thawing of the Arctic permafrost and the subsequent release of huge amounts of methane, a particularly potent greenhouse gas, which would accelerate global warming. This and other events, like the possible melting of the West Antarctic and Greenland ice sheets, large rises in sea levels, extinction events, and widespread floods, are all reasons that we should be paying smaller amounts today as insurance against these types of tail events. And I should note that the social cost of carbon that we use as a basis for developing this and other climate regulations is based really on the central estimate of what will happen, and as a result is too conservative in that it doesn't price in some of the benefits of reducing this uncertainty. Ideally, the way to deal with climate change would be a market-based program that addresses greenhouse gas emissions from all sectors, including transportation, manufacturing, and agriculture. By spreading emissions reductions across all of these sectors, we could take advantage of the lowest hanging fruit and ensure that we're not making relatively costly reductions in one area where we could have accomplished the same ultimate goal in terms of carbon in a different area. But given just how much emissions come from electricity, given that most of the modeling shows that at the margin, the cheapest reductions are even more disproportionately than that 32% from the electricity sector, the Clean Power Plan is a very promising area to start. Now, in conclusion, I would say climate change is often thought of as a scientific problem. It's often thought of as something that is in tension with or contrary or different to our broader economic concerns. I've tried to convince you that climate considerations are part of our broader energy strategy, and that if you use some of the basic analytical tools in economics and apply them in this area, you'll, one, find a very strong justification for action, and two, it'll help you think about the best and most efficient ways to act. We are currently in the middle of a big dialogue about these issues, and that debate will only switch to what each state does to comply with this plan, and what further steps the federal government can take in all of the different sectors that are producing greenhouse gases. But we'll be in a better position to do all of that as part of an overall economic plan that is investing in oil, gas, renewables, using less, in other words, and all of the above energy strategy. So with that, I thank you for your attention and interest, and happy to take any questions. And as I said, I like this topic, but I also like tax reform, healthcare, labor markets, the international economy, the internet, infrastructure, financial regulation. Usually, most days you do at least 6 of those in my job. So, yeah.
Can you speak to the news of the Rockefeller Foundation declaring today that they're giving up on carbon?
Right. I certainly read that article and saw that and found it interesting. I don't have a particular view on what foundations or endowments should do with their investment, but more broadly, when dealing with the issue of climate change, what we're trying to do is not just public policies like the rules I was talking about, but also mobilizations like bringing people to the White House, bring major companies and getting them to make the type of HFC commitments that we got last week. So dealing with this is going to be a top-up and a little bit of setting the incentives. I mean, a bottom-up and a little bit of setting incentives from the top-down effort.
Malik was saying I'm a second-year PhD in economics here. And so I was wondering, since not all states have the same access to renewables, like solar is in the Southwest mainly, how best would it be to balance some of the incentives to reduce emissions with that homogeneity?
Yeah. Well, what the EPA did was they looked at each state and they tried to study their power plants really carefully. And you have a lot of coal plants that are using an old technology to translate the heat into electricity, and a bunch of it's getting lost. You don't. So you could improve a lot, you couldn't. You're a state that has great potential for solar. And they added up using existing technologies, and that's what the law requires, by the way. You could ask whether there's different ways to do it. The Clean Air Act is about using the best existing technologies. And so for each state, they looked at those 4 things. What are your coal plants like? What potential do you have for natural gas? What is your potential for renewables, and how much could you do efficiency? And they assigned a target. So some states have to cut emissions by a lot. Some are closer to it and already doing a lot of that, so they only have to cut it by a little. They then put their plan out in June for public comment, and the president's directed them to have a final plan next June. So all sorts of states and industries and individuals are weighing in, saying, hey, our state, you forgot we actually have more solar potential. Give us a lower target. Or, how could you do this to us? There's no way we could hit that target. Give us a higher target. And based on those comments, they'll be working through that methodology for the state-by-state numbers. Yeah, in the back.
I was actually referring to this graph as well. And one thing you didn't really touch on, because it kind of splits the difference between two sectors, is nuclear.
Uh-huh.
And I was hoping you could speak to a little bit about what's going on with that now, and then in general, how much of nuclear policy you think is truly economic analysis, and how much of it is sort of wrangling public opinion and sort of reactionary types of things to certain situations.
Nuclear is certainly is a low emissions way to generate electricity. We certainly think it's part of the answer. 2 years ago, we proposed a clean power standard. A lot of states have a renewable portfolio standard. And renewable portfolio standard says you have to use a certain amount of renewables, which is generally wind, solar, et cetera. We did a clean power standard, was our proposal 2 years ago. And the thing that made it different from a renewable standard is that it lets you use nuclear to satisfy it, and it gave you partial credit for using natural gas to satisfy it, reflecting that it's half the emissions of coal. So we haven't built a new reactor in a while. There's a lot of liability and public perception and other issues. A lot of that is a matter for local decision making. But I think in terms of the incentives that we set, those incentives should be about reducing your carbon emissions. And if it's cheaper to reduce them through more reliance on nuclear, that's perfectly great. In some cases it won't be because of liabilities, because there's some cost to this set of public concerns. But we certainly would like to see more of an incentive for nuclear insofar as it's reducing emissions as part of the overall solution. So, yeah, in the back.
In one of our classes, we were learning about how, yes, domestic coal use is declining, but coal imports are increasing. So
Coal exports.
Exports, sorry,
Uh-huh.
exports, yes. So even though we're not burning it here, we're still exporting it, and the fact that we're not burning it, somebody else does, is still a problem. Can you comment on that?
Yeah, I think that's why a worldwide solution is important. What we need to be doing is working with everyone around the world to lower their emissions. And the main way in which we can work with other countries to get them to lower their emissions is by doing it here. And the United States has a much better hand to exert its leadership in this area because of what we've done with the Cancun commitment, with the Clean Power Plan, with the vehicle rule, and with everything else we've done. And so I think the solution to that is going to coming from reducing demand overseas. But I think, yeah.
I'm Thomas, sophomore in Wharton. I was just is this like an environmental federalism question? So how exactly will the EPA enforce each state's targets? And I guess related to that is how will it relate to existing cap and trade programs like RGGI or California's and stuff?
Right. So we're certainly trying to, the EPA is trying to design it in a way that would fit well with the types of good models that you have out there, like RGGI. The Clean Air Act has a 40-year history of how to implement it, and it basically will have a final rule next year. In the summer of 2015, states will have a year to come forward with their plans. If you want to do multi-state, you can get an extension on it. And then the EPA monitors to make sure states are keeping up with their plans, and like it does throughout the Clean Air Act, there's consequences for not doing it. So this is certainly very much of a federalism approach. Again, you could, there's a lot of different, you could debate a lot of different sides of that issue, but it is something we have seen in places like SOX and NOx, it be an effective way to embed a market-based system in that federal system and have that happen from the bottom up. Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak a bit about how the decrease in natural gas prices are affecting transportation, what the expectations or hopes are for decrease in emissions going forward in the transportation sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. A lot of the emissions reductions we've had have been just more fuel-efficient cars in general, and hybrids and electricity. I think in the political system, you can too often find people who can talk with great confidence about what the future is, and especially people get really excited about the vehicle sector, and is it hydrogen, and is it natural gas, and is it electricity? I, for one, don't know. And the response to not knowing is you want policies that are relatively technologically neutral. So if you have a fuel efficiency standard, you can satisfy that in a lot of different ways. If you have market mechanisms for carbon, you can satisfy that in a lot of different ways. I think natural gas will be part of that, and you see that. It's potentially more promising with things. There's always a chicken and egg problem with these two. You need the gas stations and you need the vehicles, and you only get one if you have both. There's a little bit less of a chicken and egg problem with trucks because they use something like 300 major refueling stations spread out across the country as opposed to cars, which use obviously a lot more gas stations. So installing those for trucks is a little bit easier. So maybe you can do it in trucks in a way that you couldn't in cars. On the other hand, going to the other end, I'm not aware of a technology that would let you use natural gas to power an airplane. That's going to be liquid fuels for a long time, and certainly not a battery-powered airplane. It's going to be liquid fuels for some time to come. But even with liquid, there's advanced biofuels, for example, that have lower carbon content that could help with the aviation sector. So I think there'll be different things with different modes of transportation. I think we have some ideas of what they are, but also a lot of ignorance, and our policy should be mindful of and respectful of that ignorance. Yeah.
Jackie here. I'm a second-year Wharton MBA student. Moving away from energy policy for a moment, if they're moving into the last 2 years of the administration, if there were one policy area or piece of the economic policy agenda that you personally could prioritize in those final 2 years, what would it be and why?
If we could just do one thing outside of this area, I would choose immigration. I think as an economic policy, it's probably the biggest lever we have for economic growth. One of the challenges we have for economic growth is our demography, and immigration just brings more bodies into the country, which helps. If you look at the Congressional Budget Office, they estimated it would add $1.4 trillion to GDP, and that isn't just those extra bodies. It is the extra, what's called total factor productivity, the way you combine your capital and labor into greater amounts of output. And that's because immigrants are more likely to patent, more likely to start a business, to be entrepreneurial. It's not just that, though. It's you look at the more than 10 million undocumented people here in this country, and it's not just a heartbreaking, tragic situation when you see families separated. But just again, in purely economic terms, I hear from business people all the time about how uncertainty reduces investment. Well, if you're not sure whether or not you're going to be allowed to stay in our country, that's a lot of uncertainty, and that makes you less likely to invest in school and a business. So I think the economic certainty and a pathway to citizenship for that group helps the economy a lot. And then all of this, by helping the economy, would also do more for our long-term budget deficit than many of the other options under debate and consideration. So, I have a top 5 or 10 list, but that's my top 1 list. And, yeah.
My name is Vinay. I'm from the first year MBA student. One question I had is the Kyoto Protocol there's a big debate whether it was largely successful or not. I think now the US signing up for the Cancun Agreement. So could you comment upon how successful do you think this will be going forward?
This is the only way we can deal with it. And the model we have now is each country is bringing its commitments to the table and essentially mutually surveilling other countries in their commitments. And this is prodding a little bit more of a race to the top. I think it benefits from the fact that there's an increased appreciation, as I was saying before, in the context of China, for example, and in the context of the United States, of these types of co-benefits and these reasons that aren't just about climate change, although that should be more than enough reason, but that immediately affect other issues and challenges that countries are dealing with. We've also seen in this country, emissions have been increasing. They're now decreasing. You've seen emissions decreasing in Europe and other parts of the world. So still global emissions are still rising, But you've seen some places where we're getting decreases, and some countries like China that hadn't made commitments before making them. So to me, it feels like we're in a much more promising place in the global discussion. But anything that has this type of collective action challenges, dealing with sovereign countries, not all of which are always rational in every single public policy thing they do every minute, the United States being the exception, of course. There's going to always be challenges. So, yeah.
To the extent middle-class families have any wealth, it's almost not exclusively in real estate and you're specifically among Social Security, which are both very low-return assets. Can you comment on the use of having a sovereign wealth fund invest in slightly higher return assets to provide higher Social Security benefits in the future?
Yeah, I don't think, that's a complicated thing, and Kent knows a lot about it as well. I think there's a lot of things we should do to help wealth creation. I think one of the first ones is looking less at the rate of return and more just on what the availability of savings is to you and work. I guess Bridget was here when she did her work, right? Work some deserter who once was at Wharton did, and others have shown that things like automatic enrollment are much more potent. So a proposal that we have, which is based on something that Heritage and Brookings did together, is if you don't have a pension through your workplace will set up an automatic IRA for you. They'll automatically deduct your pay into it and put it into it. And then if you want to opt out, you can. I think ideas like that would help build wealth. Investing the Social Security Trust Fund in the stock market, I think just sort of reallocates risk around in the economy and wouldn't really increase the net rate of return for people. So, yeah.
So if one way to drive investment in desirable outcomes is to increase the cost of less desirable outcomes, here I'm thinking of renewables versus petroleum, is there appetite, do you think, for allowing exports of petroleum products, sort of a greater range of them, in order to raise the cost of petrol in the United States to what countries in Europe and elsewhere are seeing as a way to drive investment to a renewable outcomes?
That's not something we have a plan to do. I would want to correct you on your premise, though.
Sure.
When you allow oil exports, it could potentially result in increased U.S. production. And so the effect of it on U.S. gasoline prices is ambiguous, and some estimates that I've seen have had those gas prices going down because the production effect outweighs the other effect. Yeah.
Yeah, just another question on the energy policy. Another problem I've been trying to work through is the idea of baseload demand versus peak demand in power generation, how solar panels aren't that helpful between 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. when residential consumers need electricity. Do you have a particular view on theories of time in use charging for electricity for both residential and commercial people and driving investment for power at the right time?
Right. I mean, again, I'd go back to the same refuge I had in answering the earlier question about vehicles, which is I don't think we need to know the exact answer to that question. I think we need to set the incentives right and then let utilities, let consumers figure out what are the most convenient, what are the most inexpensive ways to handle those issues. And a lot of different ideas will emerge, and the process of competition means some of those ideas will flourish and succeed and others will wither. So I don't view myself as an expert on that, and I don't think you should make policy on the basis of assuming you are an expert. I think, in fact, precisely the opposite here. The whole point of policy is to unleash the ingenuity of others. That being said, I mean, that's something that a lot of people and utilities will need to work through. So yeah, you're starting to raise your hand.
Ann Harrison, I'm a professor at Wharton. One thing that has changed the energy landscape but hasn't been mentioned is hydraulic fracturing, better known as fracking.
Right.
And I guess one question is, it seems as if sort of regulating that has been left largely to the states, which is a concern for small pot. So I was wondering, is there anything on the table? Are you considering sort of more sort of national legislation to regulate that?
Yeah, And I didn't use the word, but obviously that was what I was implicitly talking about when I was talking about those big increases in oil and natural gas production. I think a lot of the biggest issues with fracking are a matter of local environmental impact, and that's something that communities need to decide for themselves. And so a lot of that regulation is appropriately at the local level. In terms of the administration, the president has, on the one hand, been very encouraging about these trends in natural gas and in oil. It's something he's spoken about, the United States being the Saudi Arabia of wind. But at the other hand, the EPA has tried to create greater transparency around the types of chemicals that are used in this process, around the consequences of it, and make it so that people can have a little bit more certainty and understanding about what's going on. You don't seem to love that answer, though.
Well, I'm a little bit surprised because this would be, to me, it would seem to be a case of a classic externality. So if you're based in North or South Dakota, you would have an incentive in a situation where there are very few jobs to sort of redefine sort of what the benefits and costs are relative to, say, a New York or even possibly Pennsylvania. It would seem that that would sort of drive very different standards and potential costs. Just a question.
Well, even there, let's say the premise of your question was right. I don't know that it's an externality. It might mean that on the margin, a job actually matters more in one place than another, and people balance it differently. But I think there are externalities, and I think shouldn't be like the Wild West, where everyone gets to do whatever it is they want, wherever they want. We need transparency. We need to make sure it's being done in a safe and environmental manner. There's a little bit of a role for the federal government there, but there's a lot of a role for states. Yeah.
This role of the state governments and energy policy that you're referring to, do you think it's changed since the beginning of the administration? Is it a function of a real belief in federalism in this policy area, or more sort of pragmatism related to how hard it's been to get anything done?
This has been such a rapidly evolving landscape. We were building natural gas terminals to import natural gas because we couldn't make enough. We thought we weren't able to make enough here, and we need it from the rest of the world. Now we're turning those terminals around, so starting next year we'll be in a position to export natural gas to the rest of the world. And this is all because of fracking, and it's something that's happening rapidly that everyone's trying to get their heads around. But I think the basic model is the same as the basic model that we've seen in for conventional natural gas and conventional oil, and that's evolved over a century in those areas. There are some externalities, by the way. So there's an issue of how much methane is emitted, and methane is a particularly potent, as I said, greenhouse gas. And we've adopted a methane strategy, and we'll be looking and doing more in that area to deal with methane emissions that come from it. And that's something that North Dakota doesn't have the same incentives that we as a country have, because once the methane goes up, it affects the whole country. So there are certain important areas like that. Yeah. Or maybe you and then him.
Thank you. So you talked earlier about the idea of a race to the top, and there's a similar situation with the development of the next generation of nuclear power plants. So we're still relying on plants built in the 70s. Right. But you have countries like India and China, they're investing extremely heavily in developing new technology, cheaper technology, and safer technology. Is there a situation where America is going to fall behind and lose its position as the premier nuclear contractor of the world in that sense?
I was in China over the summer talking to them about, among other things, this set of issues, and they were constantly interested in our technology, and especially our green technology, especially in the area of nuclear. So there's an enormous number of things that our companies can still do, and that our companies are doing, working in partnership around the world. So to some degree, we've seen a market expanding in a number of places for American companies and their innovation in this space. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. There's a lot more competition, and I think in general we should welcome competition. It spurs innovation, and we'll develop ideas that will benefit all of us. So, you were next.
Josh Bowell, Master in Environmental Studies. You made a very interesting point about delaying action affects international leverage, and I might make the case that perhaps that's already been the case, that there's an internal contradiction behind the fact that while emissions in the US have decreased, much of the rest of the world, perhaps due to the effects of past agreements or opportunities that were missed, such as the 2009 Copenhagen summit, that much of the rest of the world may feel disenchanted. And perhaps that's a case then, and one may consider it to be better marketing, perhaps, for taking international action and taking a leadership role in that. So whether that might be marketing what has been done already and the fact that US emissions are decreasing, or whether that's taking a leading role in securing some form of agreement that might reinstate the US's position as a leading force in agreements on this.
I mean, there's sort of a lot of different things. I guess I'm not sure that I agree with you. I mean, you have countries coming forward that hadn't come forward with new commitments. You have places like Germany that are willing to, I've talked about upping the commitments that they've made and exceeding those goals. I think U.S. leadership, I care a lot about this country. I care a lot about this country's leadership. I think it's particularly important in this space. I think it will be hard for anything to get done without that leadership. And a lot of that leadership, has to be by example. And that's what we're trying to do now. The discussions in Paris next year will be very important. The goals that we and other countries choose to set for post-2020 will be very important, because a 2020 goal, most of the policy levers we're talking about, they matter a little bit for hitting that 2020, but most of this is about what happens after then. And I don't know. I think I feel better about that set of discussions than having a long time.
All right. So why don't you join me in thanking again, Jake.